The woman who stumbled through the doorway of the Holbrook saloon looked like she had been dragged through hell backward, and Florence Northwood knew the exact moment his life changed when their eyes met across the smoky room. It was June of 1883, and the Arizona heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. But there was nothing illusory about the desperate fear in her green eyes, or the way she clutched her side where blood seeped through her dusty riding dress. Florence had been sitting at the same corner table for 8 days straight, hadn't left the room above the saloon where he'd been holed up since the incident with the Clayton gang, and his hollow eyes reflected a man who had given up on everything except the bottom of a whiskey bottle. But when she fell to her knees right there on the saloon floor, something ancient and protective stirred in his chest, something he thought had died along with his brother 3 months prior. "Somebody help her," a voice called out, but the dozen men in the saloon just stared. Nobody wanted trouble in Holbrook, not with the territorial marshal cracking down on outlaws and the Apache situation heating up again in the mountains. Florence pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady from days of sitting and drinking, and crossed the room before his better judgment could stop him. "I've got her," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He knelt beside her and saw that she was young, maybe 23 or 24, with auburn hair escaping from a braid and freckles scattered across her nose. Her eyes focused on him with an intensity that made him forget about the whiskey haze. "They're coming," she whispered. "They're right behind me." Florence didn't ask who. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she was despite being tall, and carried her toward the stairs. The saloon owner, a grizzled man named Pete who had been tolerating Florence's presence for a week and a day, blocked his path. "Now hold on, Northwood. I don't want no trouble in my establishment." "Then look away," Florence said flatly. His blue eyes, hollow as they were, still carried enough menace to make Pete step aside. Florence had been a ranch foreman before everything went to hell, had managed 30 men and 1,000 head of cattle, and some authority never quite left a man's bearing. He carried her up the narrow stairs to his room, the same room he hadn't left in 8 days, where empty bottles lined the windowsill and his bedroll lay tangled on the floor. He set her down gently on the unmade bed and lit the oil lamp with shaking hands. "Let me see," he said, and she moved her hand away from her side. The wound wasn't deep, just a graze from a bullet that had torn through fabric and skin but missed anything vital. He'd seen worse, had patched up worse on the ranch when men got careless with firearms or cattle got ornery. "What's your name?" he asked as he tore strips from his one clean shirt and poured water from the pitcher into the basin. "Clara," she said through gritted teeth as he cleaned the wound. "Clara Thornton, Florence Northwood. Most people call me Ford." He worked efficiently despite the tremor in his hands, years of practical experience overriding the whiskey fog. "Who's after you, Clara?" "The Dawson brothers. 3 of them. I witnessed them rob the stage from Winslow 2 days ago, and they know I can identify them." She winced as he pressed the cloth against her side. "They killed the driver and the guard, shot them both in cold blood while they were begging for mercy." Ford's jaw tightened. He knew the Dawson brothers by reputation, 3 vicious outlaws who'd been terrorizing the territory for months. The territorial marshal had a hefty bounty on each of their heads, but nobody had been able to bring them in. "Why didn't you go to the marshal? Holbrook doesn't have one. The last marshal got shot 3 weeks ago, and they haven't sent a replacement yet." Clara's voice was steadier now, and she watched him with those sharp green eyes that seemed to see straight through his hollowed-out shell. "I was trying to get to Flagstaff, but they caught up to me outside of town. I barely got away." Ford finished bandaging her side and sat back on his heels. 8 days he'd been in this room, drowning in grief and guilt and rage over his brother's death. 8 days of staring at the same 4 walls and trying to forget the look on Thomas's face when the Clayton gang had gunned him down over a card game dispute. 8 days of being a hollow-eyed ghost of the man he used to be, but Clara Thornton was alive and bleeding in his room, and 3 killers were coming for her. "You need to hide," he said. "There's a boarding house on the other side of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She's tough as nails and doesn't ask questions. I'll take you there after dark." "They'll find me eventually," Clara said quietly. "Holbrook isn't that big, and I can't run forever." She was right, and Ford knew it. He stood and paced to the window, looking down at the dusty main street of Holbrook. The town had maybe 300 permanent residents, scattered among the saloons, general stores, and adobe houses that lined the single main road and a handful of side streets. The railroad had come through last year, bringing prosperity and trouble in equal measure. Beyond the town, the painted desert stretched in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the brutal Arizona sun. "Then we need to get word to the territorial marshal in Flagstaff," Ford said. "Have them send deputies to bring the Dawson brothers in. That's 3 days' ride from here, and the telegraph line is down. Lightning storm took it out last week." Clara struggled to sit up, her face pale but determined. "I heard people talking about it at the stage stop before the robbery." Ford cursed under his breath. Of course, nothing in this God-forsaken territory worked when you needed it. He turned back to Clara and really looked at her for the first time. Despite the blood and dust and fear, there was a strength in her features, a set to her jaw that spoke of resilience. She wore a simple traveling dress of dark blue cotton, practical and worn from hard use, and her hands had calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of work. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Before all this happened, California." "My aunt has a ranch near Sacramento, said she could use help managing it." Clara's expression softened slightly. "My parents died last winter of pneumonia, both of them within a week of each other. They had a small farm in Kansas, but I couldn't keep it going alone. So I sold everything and bought a stage ticket west." "I'm sorry," Ford said, and meant it. He knew what it was like to lose family, knew the hollow ache that never quite went away. "What about you?" Clara asked, her eyes moving around the room, taking in the bottles and the unmade bed and the general air of dissolution. "What are you hiding from up here?" Ford should have deflected, should have told her it was none of her business. But something about her direct gaze made him want to be honest, to confess to another human being what had been eating him alive for 3 months. "My brother," he said simply. "The Clayton gang killed him over a poker game in Santa Fe, shot him in the street like a dog. I tracked them for 2 weeks, but I lost their trail near White River. Been drinking ever since." "Why did you stop tracking them?" The question was quiet but pointed, and Ford felt it like a blade between his ribs. "Because I realized that even if I found them, even if I killed every last one of them, it wouldn't bring Thomas back. It wouldn't change anything. And I was turning into something he wouldn't have recognized, something mean and cold and dead inside." Clara was silent for a long moment, and Ford waited for her to say something platitudinous about healing and moving on, the kind of empty comfort strangers always offered. But instead she said, "Your brother wouldn't want you to waste away in this room either." Ford laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You didn't know him. You don't know anything about it." "No," Clara agreed. "But I know about losing people you love, and I know that they'd want us to keep living even when it feels impossible." She met his eyes steadily. "You came down those stairs for me. That means some part of you isn't ready to give up yet." Before Ford could respond, the sound of horses thundered outside and rough voices called out in the street. He moved to the window and looked down to see 3 men dismounting in front of the saloon, all of them armed and dangerous looking. The tallest one had a scar running from his eye to his jaw, and Ford recognized him from wanted posters as Jack Dawson, the eldest and meanest of the 3 brothers. "They're here," he said quietly. Clara's face went pale, but she didn't panic. Instead, she stood up carefully, one hand pressed to her bandaged side, and looked around the room. "Is there another way out?" "Window opens onto a ledge that runs to the back stairs," Ford said. "But you're in no condition to be climbing around on roofs. I'm in no condition to be caught by the Dawson brothers either." Clara moved to the window despite the obvious pain it caused her. "Are you coming with me?" Ford should have said no. Should have told her to go, that he wanted no part of this, that 8 days of drinking had stripped away whatever heroic impulses he might have once possessed. But instead he grabbed his gun belt from where it hung on the bedpost, the twin Colt revolvers he'd been too numb to even clean in over a week, and buckled it around his waist. "Stay close," he said, and helped her out onto the ledge. The Arizona heat hit them like a physical force, the sun beating down on the wooden shingles and making the air shimmer. Ford could hear boots pounding up the stairs inside the saloon, could hear Jack Dawson's voice demanding to know where the woman had gone. Pete would hold them off for maybe 30 seconds before he gave up Ford's location, if that. They edged along the narrow ledge, Clara moving slowly because of her injury and Ford staying between her and the drop to the alley below. His heart was pounding, and he realized with some surprise that he felt alive for the first time in 8 days, that the fog of whiskey and despair had burned away in the clarity of immediate danger. They reached the back stairs and descended quickly, Ford supporting Clara when she stumbled. The alley behind the saloon was empty except for a few chickens scratching in the dust and a mangy dog sleeping in the shade. Ford led Clara away from the main street, cutting through the narrow spaces between buildings toward the eastern edge of town. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, breathing hard. "Somewhere they won't think to look." Ford had lived in Holbrook for 3 years before his brother's death, working as foreman at the Double R Ranch just outside of town. He knew every building and back alley, every place a person could hide in a settlement this size. "There's an old adobe church about half a mile from here. Hasn't been used since the new church got built last year. We can hide there until I figure out what to do." They moved quickly through the heat, staying off the main street and using the buildings as cover. Ford could hear shouting behind them, the Dawson brothers tearing through the saloon looking for Clara. His hollow eyes scanned constantly for threats, for any sign they'd been spotted, and his hands rested on his revolvers. The old church sat at the edge of town, where Holbrook started giving way to open desert, its adobe walls crumbling and its wooden cross tilted at a drunken angle. Ford led Clara inside through the sagging door, into the cool dimness that smelled of dust and abandonment. Wooden pews still lined the small nave, and faded paintings of saints watched from the walls with patient eyes. Clara sank onto one of the pews, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. Blood had seeped through the bandage at her side, a dark stain spreading across the blue fabric of her dress. Ford knelt beside her and checked the wound, relieved to see it hadn't reopened badly, just stressed from all the movement. "You should have left me," Clara said quietly. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. And now you're caught up in this mess." Ford looked at her tired face, at the fear she was trying so hard to hide, and something shifted in his chest. For 8 days he'd been hollow, empty, a ghost haunting a rented room. But Clara Thornton had fallen through that door, and suddenly he had something to care about again, something beyond his own grief and guilt. "Maybe I needed to be caught up in something," he said. Maybe sitting in that room was killing me slower than a bullet would have. Clara's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the edge of the pew. Her fingers were warm despite everything, alive and real. "Thank you, Ford, for helping me, for not looking away." They sat in the dim church while the afternoon heat pressed down on Holbrook like a weight. Ford's mind was racing, trying to work out their next move. The Dawson brothers wouldn't give up easily, not when Clara could send them to the gallows. And without a marshal in town, there was no law to appeal to, no authority to protect her. "Tell me about your ranch," Ford said after a while, wanting to distract both of them from their immediate danger. "The one you ran with your brother." Clara's expression brightened slightly despite their circumstances. "The Double R, best ranch in this part of Arizona. We run about 1,500 head of cattle, have water rights to a good creek that flows year-round. Thomas and I built it up from nothing over 5 years." He paused, the familiar ache settling in his chest at his brother's name. Thomas was the dreamer, always seeing possibilities. I was the practical one, making sure we didn't go broke chasing those dreams. We made a good team. "It sounds wonderful," Clara said wistfully. "My parents' farm was small, just 40 acres and a few crops. But I loved working the land, watching things grow. There's something satisfying about building something with your own hands." "What happened to it? The ranch, I mean." Ford's jaw tightened. "I left after Thomas died. Couldn't stand to be there without him, seeing his things everywhere, remembering. The owner hired a new foreman, and I just started drifting. Ended up in Holbrook because it was far enough from Santa Fe but close enough to the ranch that I could tell myself I might go back someday." "Will you?" "Go back? I don't know." Ford stood and paced to the church's one intact window, looking out at the desert. "Everything I built there was with Thomas. I don't know if I can do it without him." Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say that the people we love never really leave us. They live on in what they taught us, in how they changed us. Your brother gave you 5 years of building something together. That doesn't disappear just because he's gone." Ford wanted to argue, to say she didn't understand, but the words stuck in his throat. Because maybe she was right. Maybe Thomas's death didn't erase everything they'd accomplished together, didn't invalidate all the hard work and dreams and plans. Maybe Ford had been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd forgotten what he still had. The sound of horses interrupted his thoughts. Ford moved quickly to the window and saw Jack Dawson and his brothers riding down the street, their eyes scanning every building. They were searching systematically, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the old church. "We need to move," Ford said. "They're getting closer." Clara stood, moving better now after the rest, and followed him to the back of the church where a small door led out to the desert. Ford's mind was racing through options, none of them good. They could try to hide in the desert, but the Dawson brothers could track them easily in the soft sand and sparse vegetation. They could make a run for the ranch, but that was a 2-hour ride and Clara was injured. They could try to find allies in town, but most people would rather not get involved with dangerous outlaws. "Ford," Clara said, her hand on his arm, "we can't keep running. Eventually they'll catch us, or I'll slow you down too much, or something will go wrong. We need to end this. End it how?" "There are 3 of them, all killers. I'm good with a gun, but not good enough to take on 3 men at once." Clara's green eyes were thoughtful. "What if we didn't have to fight them all at once? What if we could separate them, pick them off one at a time?" Ford stared at her. "That's a dangerous game. If anything goes wrong, if they figure out what we're doing, we're both dead. And if we keep hiding, we're dead anyway, just slower." Clara's voice was steady, certain. "I'm tired of running, Ford. I'm tired of being afraid. These men killed innocent people in cold blood, and they'll keep doing it unless someone stops them. Maybe that someone is us. Looking at her determined face, her shoulders squared despite the pain she must be feeling, Ford felt something like admiration stir in his chest. This woman who'd stumbled into the saloon just hours ago, bleeding and terrified, was now suggesting they hunt the men who'd been hunting her. It was crazy and dangerous and probably suicidal, but it was also the most alive Ford had felt since his brother died. "All right," he said slowly. "But we do this smart. We set a trap, use the terrain and the element of surprise, and if things start going wrong, you run. You get on a horse and you ride for Flagstaff and you don't look back. Understood?" Clara nodded, but Ford could see in her eyes that she had no intention of running if things went bad. She was stubborn, this Clara Thornton, stubborn and brave and probably too good for a hollow-eyed drunk who'd spent 8 days feeling sorry for himself. They spent the next hour planning, using Ford's knowledge of Holbrook and the surrounding area to devise a trap. The old mining office at the north end of town had been abandoned for years, its timbers rotting and its interior a maze of rooms and passages. If they could lure the Dawson brothers there, separate them in the darkness and confusion, they might have a chance. "We need bait," Clara said. "Something to draw them in." "You," Ford said flatly. "They want you. We let them see you, let them chase you into the building, then I come in behind and we take them one at a time. You make it sound so simple. It won't be, but it's the best chance we have." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Ford and Clara made their way through the back streets to the old mining office. Ford's heart was pounding, and his hands no longer shook from whiskey withdrawal but from adrenaline and fear. Not fear for himself, he realized, but fear for Clara. Somewhere in the space of a few hours, she'd become important to him, more important than his own survival. They positioned themselves carefully. Clara would show herself on the street, then run into the mining office when the Dawson brothers spotted her. Ford would be waiting inside, hidden in the shadows with his revolvers loaded and ready. It was a simple plan, which meant there were 1,000 ways it could go wrong. "Be careful," Ford said as Clara prepared to step out onto the street. The words felt inadequate, too small for what he wanted to say. That she'd given him something to fight for, something to care about. That for 8 days he'd been dead inside and she'd somehow brought him back to life. Clara looked at him with those green eyes that saw too much, and she smiled. "You too, Ford. I'd like the chance to know you better when we're not running for our lives." Then she was gone, stepping out into the fading sunlight. Ford moved into position inside the mining office, finding a spot behind a collapsed beam where he could see the entrance but remain hidden. His revolvers were in his hands, familiar weight after so many years, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. He heard Clara's voice outside calling out, then the thunder of hooves and rough shouts. The Dawson brothers had found her. Ford's muscles tensed, every sense heightened. He heard Clara's footsteps running toward the building, heard her burst through the door and disappear into the maze of rooms toward the back like they'd planned. Jack Dawson came through the door first, his scarred face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "End of the line, girl. Nowhere left to run." His 2 brothers followed, spreading out to cover more ground. They were professionals, Ford realized. They knew how to hunt. This wasn't going to be as easy as he'd hoped. Ford waited until they'd moved deeper into the building, until their eyes were still adjusting to the dimness after the bright street outside. Then he stepped out from behind the beam and fired. The shot caught the youngest Dawson brother in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering to the floor. The other 2 reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. Bullets splintered the wood around Ford's head and he dropped and rolled, coming up behind a different piece of cover. "Northwood," Jack Dawson called out. "Pete at the saloon told us you were helping her. Big mistake. Now you both die." Ford didn't waste breath on a reply. He fired again, forcing the Dawsons to keep their heads down while he repositioned. The middle brother, a stocky man with a thick beard, tried to flank him and Ford put a bullet through his leg. The man went down cursing, and suddenly the odds were a lot better. But Jack Dawson was good, better than his brothers. He moved like smoke through the building, using every shadow and piece of cover. Ford could hear him but couldn't get a clean shot. And somewhere in the back, Clara was hiding, hopefully staying out of the line of fire. "You can't win this, Northwood," Jack called out. "I'm going to kill you and then I'm going to take my time with that girl. Make her pay for all the trouble she's caused." Rage flared in Ford's chest, hot and clarifying. He moved silently through the building, using techniques he'd learned during 2 years in the cavalry before he'd settled down to ranch work. The mining office was a death trap of rotting floors and unstable walls, but Ford used it to his advantage, circling around to come at Jack from an unexpected angle. He found the outlaw in what had been the main office, crouched behind an overturned desk with his gun trained on the doorway. Ford could have shot him in the back, ended it quickly and without honor, but something made him speak instead. "Dawson, face me." Jack spun, his gun coming up, but Ford was faster. His first shot took Jack in the right shoulder, the gun arm, and the revolver fell from nerveless fingers. His second shot, the one he'd been aiming for all along, took Jack in the chest. The outlaw fell backward, surprise written across his scarred face, and was dead before he hit the floor. Ford stood there, breathing hard, his revolver still trained on Jack's body. He'd killed men before, during the war between settlers and rustlers 2 years back, but it never got easier, never stopped making him feel hollow inside. "Ford," Clara's voice came from the back of the building, frightened and hopeful. "It's over," he called back. "It's safe." She emerged from the shadows, her face pale and her bandage spotted with fresh blood, but alive. So beautifully, impossibly alive. Ford holstered his guns and went to her, and she collapsed against his chest. He held her while she shook, held her while the fear and adrenaline drained away, held her like she was something precious. "You did it," she whispered against his shirt. "You saved me." "We did it," Ford corrected gently. "Together." They stood like that for a long moment while the sun set outside and the shadows grew long. Ford could hear the Dawson brothers groaning in pain in other parts of the building, the ones who'd survived. They'd need to be tied up and held for the territorial marshal, would need medical attention. There were things to do, practical matters to attend to. But for just a moment, Ford let himself hold Clara and feel the warmth of her against him, feel the steady beat of her heart that meant she was alive and safe. For 8 days he'd been hollow, empty, a ghost haunting a rented room. But Clara Thornton had fallen through that door, and everything had changed. The marshal arrived from Flagstaff 3 days later with a contingent of deputies, drawn by the telegram Ford sent, once they'd gotten the telegraph lines repaired. He took custody of the surviving Dawson brothers and confirmed that there was a substantial reward for their capture. The money would be split between Ford and Clara, enough to give them both a fresh start if they wanted it. During those 3 days of waiting, Ford and Clara stayed at the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, who proved to be exactly as tough and discreet as Ford had promised. Clara's wound was healing well, the doctor pronounced, though she'd have a scar. Ford found that he liked the idea of her having a scar, a permanent reminder of her strength and courage. They talked during those 3 days, really talked in a way Ford hadn't talked to anyone since Thomas died. Clara told him about growing up on a Kansas farm, about parents who'd loved each other and worked hard and died too young, about her dream of running a ranch in California, of building something lasting. Ford told her about his years in the cavalry, about meeting Thomas and falling in love with ranching, about the slow, satisfying work of building the double R from nothing into something fine. "You think you'll go back?" Clara asked on the evening of the second day. They were sitting on Mrs. Patterson's front porch, watching the desert stars emerge in a sky so vast it made Ford's heart ache. "To the ranch, I mean." Ford considered the question seriously. "I think I might. Not to run it necessarily, but to see it again. To remember what Thomas and I built together." He paused, then added quietly, "You were right, what you said in the church, about the people we love living on in what they taught us. Thomas taught me about vision, about seeing what could be instead of just what is. I think I'd forgotten that." Clara's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm and sure. "I'd like to see it. The ranch. If you'd want to show me." Ford's heart stumbled in his chest. 3 days they'd known each other, 3 days of danger and fear and desperate action. But it felt like longer, felt like he'd known Clara Thornton all his life. "You're supposed to be going to California, to your aunt's ranch. I could write to her, let her know I'm delayed." Clara's voice was soft but certain. "Tell her I met someone I'd like to get to know better." Ford turned to look at her in the starlight, at her freckled face and green eyes, and the strength that seemed to radiate from her very bones. He thought about the hollow-eyed ghost he'd been 8 days ago, sitting in that room above the saloon and drowning in whiskey and despair. He thought about how Clara had crashed into his life and changed everything, given him something to fight for, reminded him that there were still things worth caring about. "I'd like that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd like that very much." She smiled, that beautiful smile that lit up her whole face, and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that while the desert night settled around them, cool and vast and full of possibilities. The territorial marshal left on the morning of the 4th day, taking the Dawson brothers in chains and leaving behind a substantial bank draft for the reward money. Ford split it evenly with Clara despite her protests, and they both stood on the main street of Holbrook with more money than either had seen in years, trying to decide what came next. "Come with me to the Double R," Ford said. It wasn't a question, wasn't really even a request. It was a hope, fragile and new but real. "Come see what Thomas and I built, and then if you still want to go to California, I'll make sure you get there safely." Clara looked at him with those green eyes that saw too much and too clearly. "And if I don't want to go to California after I see it?" "What then?" Ford's heart was pounding, but he made himself say the words. "Then maybe you stay. Maybe we see what we could build together." "That's a big maybe," Clara said, but she was smiling. "We barely know each other. I know you're brave and strong and stubborn as hell. I know you didn't give up even when you had every reason to. I know that when I'm with you, I don't feel hollow anymore." Ford took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "That's enough to start with. The rest we can learn as we go." Clara's smile widened and she squeezed his hand. "All right, Ford Northwood. Show me your ranch. Show me what you and your brother built, and we'll see what happens." They bought horses and supplies at the general store, good sturdy mounts that could handle the 2-hour ride to the Double R. Ford felt a nervousness building in his chest as they rode out of Holbrook, heading northwest toward the ranch he hadn't seen in 3 months. What if it had all fallen apart in his absence? What if the new foreman had run it into the ground? What if coming back just made the grief worse instead of better? But Clara rode beside him, straight-backed and confident despite her healing injury, and her presence steadied him. The desert stretched around them in all its harsh beauty, the painted rocks glowing in the morning sun and the air so clear you could see for miles. Ford had forgotten how much he loved this land, this wild and difficult and beautiful territory. The double R appeared in the distance like a promise, the ranch buildings clustered around a creek that glinted in the sunlight. The main house was adobe and timber, built to stay cool in summer and warm in winter. The bunkhouse and barn and corrals spread out behind it, and Ford could see cattle grazing in the near pastures, their coats glossy and healthy. "Ford," a voice called out, and a tall man with graying hair emerged from the barn. It was Samuel Richards, the owner of the Double R, the man who'd given Ford and Thomas their first chance at ranch work all those years ago. "Ford Northwood, is that really you?" Ford dismounted, suddenly uncertain. "Sir, I hope you don't mind us riding in like this." Sam crossed the distance between them and pulled Ford into a rough embrace. "Mind, boy, I've been hoping you'd come back since the day you left. This place hasn't been the same without you. But you hired a new foreman. I heard he was doing well." "He's competent," Sam said, releasing Ford and studying his face. "But he's not you, doesn't have your eye for the land or your way with the men." He paused, then added gently, "I know you left because of Thomas. I understand that, but running from grief doesn't make it hurt less. You should have stayed, let your friends help you through it." Ford felt his throat tighten. "I couldn't. Everywhere I looked I saw him, remembered him. It was killing me." "And running helped." Sam's eyes, sharp despite his age, took in Ford's hollow face and the lingering tremor in his hands. "You look like hell, boy, like you've been trying to drink yourself to death." "I have been," Ford admitted, "or I was, until I met Clara." He turned to help Clara dismount, and Sam's expression shifted to curiosity as he took in this unexpected woman. Ford made the introductions, giving Sam a brief version of what had happened in Holbrook, the Dawson brothers and the gunfight and the 3 days of waiting. Sam listened with the careful attention of a man who'd been judging character for 60 years, and when Ford finished, he smiled. "Well then. Seems like you've been busy, and it seems like Miss Thornton here has been good for you." "She has," Ford said simply, meeting Clara's eyes, "better than I deserve." "Why don't you both come up to the house?" Sam suggested. "My wife will want to meet Miss Thornton, and we can talk about what comes next. If you're interested in coming back, Ford, your job is still here." "Better than that, actually. I've been thinking about retiring, letting someone else worry about the day-to-day running of this place. If you came back, we could work out an arrangement, maybe a partnership with you gradually buying me out over time." Ford stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. "Sir, I don't have that kind of money." "You have the reward money from the Dawsons," Sam pointed out. "That's a solid down payment, and you have something more important than money. You have knowledge of this land and this ranch, and you have the loyalty of the men who work here. They all asked about you, Ford. All said they'd be glad to have you back. It was too much, too sudden." Ford felt overwhelmed, his hollow eyes filling with unexpected tears. This ranch, this place he'd built with his brother, could be his, not just as a foreman working for someone else, but as a true partner with a stake in something lasting. "I need to think about it," he managed. "Need to talk to Clara." Sam nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take your time. The offer stands." They spent the rest of the day at the Double R, and Ford showed Clara everything. The house where he and Thomas had lived in the foreman's quarters, small but comfortable. The creek where they'd spent countless evenings fishing and planning improvements to the ranch. The north pasture, where they'd first started running cattle, and the south range they'd opened up after a good year of profits. The barn where Thomas had been kicked by a horse and broken his arm, and Ford had sat up with him all night making sure he was all right. "He's everywhere," Ford said as they stood by the creek in the fading light. Every inch of this place has his mark on it." Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, "Is that a bad thing? Or could it be a comfort?" Ford thought about it, really thought about it for the first time. For 3 months he'd been running from memories of Thomas, drowning them in whiskey and distance. But standing here at the ranch, surrounded by everything they'd built together, he realized Clara was right. The memories didn't have to hurt. They could be a comfort, a reminder of something good and real and meaningful. "I don't know if I can do this without him," Ford said quietly. "Run this place, make the decisions. Thomas was the one with vision. I just made his dreams real." "That's not true," Clara said firmly. "Sam told me about some of the improvements you made, the systems you put in place. Your brother may have had vision, but you had the practical knowledge to make it work. You were partners, Ford, equal partners. And just because he's gone doesn't mean you've lost your half of that partnership." Ford looked at her in the twilight, this woman who'd been in his life for less than a week, but who seemed to understand him better than people he'd known for years. "How did you get so wise?" "Losing my parents taught me things," Clara said. "Taught me that grief doesn't have to destroy you. That the people we love would want us to keep building, keep growing, keep living. Your brother loved this ranch, right? More than anything. Then the best way to honor him isn't to run away. It's to make the ranch everything you both dreamed it could be." Clara took his hand, her fingers warm and certain. "And you don't have to do it alone. If you want, if you'll have me, I could help. I know ranching. I know hard work. I know what it takes to build something lasting." Ford's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. "Clara, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to go to California," she said, her green eyes steady on his. "I'm saying that in the past few days, you've become important to me, more important than I thought possible in such a short time. I'm saying that I look at this ranch and I see possibilities, see what it could become. And I look at you and I see a man who's been through hell but who's still standing, still fighting. That's the kind of man I want to build something with." Ford pulled her close, his arms coming around her like she was something precious and fragile. But she wasn't fragile, he knew. Clara Thornton was strong as steel, brave as a lion, and stubborn enough to drag a hollow-eyed drunk out of his grief and back into the light. "I don't deserve you," he whispered against her hair. "Maybe not," she agreed, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "But you're getting me anyway, if you want me." "Want you?" Ford pulled back enough to look at her face, to see the hope and determination and affection shining in her eyes. "Clara, I've been half alive for 3 months. You made me whole again. Made me remember what it feels like to care about something, to want to build instead of destroy. Of course I want you. I'm just afraid I'll mess it up, disappoint you." "Then we'll figure it out together," Clara said simply. "That's what partners do." They stood by the creek as the stars emerged overhead, the same vast desert sky that had witnessed 1,000 stories of loss and love and redemption. Ford felt something shift in his chest, the hollow place that had been eating him alive starting to fill with something warm and real. Hope, maybe, or purpose, or just the simple joy of being with someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. The next morning, Ford told Sam he was accepting the offer. They worked out terms right there at the kitchen table while Sam's wife fed them breakfast and smiled knowingly at how often Ford and Clara's eyes met across the table. Ford would buy a quarter interest in the ranch immediately with his share of the reward money, then work to buy out Sam's remaining stake over the next 10 years. Clara would work as the ranch bookkeeper and assistant manager, using her experience from her parents' farm to help run the business side of things. "What about the foreman you hired?" Ford asked. "I don't want to put a man out of work." "He's been wanting to go back east to his family," Sam said. "This will give him an excuse to do it with a good reference and some severance pay. Everyone wins. They shook hands on it, and just like that, Ford's life had a direction again, a purpose. He was going to build this ranch into something Thomas would have been proud of, something that would last for generations. And he was going to do it with Clara by his side. The first few weeks were hard. Ford had to relearn the rhythms of ranch work, had to rebuild relationships with the hands who'd watched him fall apart after Thomas's death. But Clara was there, steady and certain, handling the accounts and the supply orders with an efficiency that made Sam shake his head in admiration. She was good with the men, too, treating them with respect but brooking no nonsense, earning their loyalty through competence and fairness. And slowly, carefully, Ford and Clara built something together beyond just the ranch. They built a relationship, learning each other's quirks and histories and dreams. Ford learned that Clara sang while she worked on the accounts, old folk songs her mother had taught her, that she was terrified of snakes but would face down an angry bull without flinching, that she missed her parents with an ache that never quite went away, but that she'd made peace with their loss in a way Ford was still learning. Clara learned that Ford was quieter than he seemed, that he processed things internally before speaking, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, that he still had nightmares about his brother's death, but they were getting less frequent, that he was gentle with animals and fair with men, and that when he gave his word, he kept it no matter the cost. They courted properly, despite living on the same ranch. Ford would ride out to wherever Clara was working and ask formally if he could walk with her, take her to see the sunset from the ridge, or show her a new calf in the pasture. They talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of trust and understanding. Ford found himself laughing again, found joy in small moments like Clara's delight when they spotted a family of deer, or her satisfaction when the accounts balanced perfectly. 2 months after they'd arrived at the Double R, Ford took Clara up to the ridge at sunset, the place where he and Thomas used to go to survey their domain and make plans for the future. The whole ranch spread out below them, the cattle like dark spots on the golden grass, and the buildings clustered around the glinting creek. "Thomas and I used to come here," Ford said quietly. "Used to talk about what we'd do when we owned this place for real, not just managing it for someone else. He wanted to double the herd, open up new pasture land to the west, said we'd build something that would last long after we were gone." Clara slipped her hand into his. "You still can. You are. We are," Ford corrected. He took a breath, gathering his courage. "Clara, I know it hasn't been long. Just a few months since you stumbled into that saloon in Holbrook. But in those months, you've changed everything. You've made me want to live again, want to build instead of destroy. You've made me remember what it feels like to hope." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small diamond, nothing fancy but real and solid and true. "I love you, Clara Thornton. I think I've loved you since you looked at me with those green eyes in the saloon and didn't see a hollow-eyed drunk, but someone worth saving. Will you marry me? Will you build this life with me, make this ranch a home?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes. Yes, Ford, I'll marry you. I love you too. I think I have since you carried me up those stairs and didn't ask questions, just helped. Since you came down from that room after 8 days of hiding and chose to fight instead of giving up." Ford slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. Then he kissed her as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. It was the same desert that had witnessed so much grief and loss, but now it was witnessing something new. Love, hope, a future. They were married 6 weeks later in the new church in Holbrook, the one with the tall steeple and the bells that rang out across the desert. Sam and his wife stood up for them, along with half the ranch hands and what felt like half of Holbrook. Even Pete from the saloon came, grinning and saying he'd known Ford was sweet on Clara from the moment he'd carried her up those stairs. Clara wore a dress of cream lace that Sam's wife had helped her pick out from the dress shop in town, and Ford wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for Thomas's funeral, and never thought he'd wear for something happy. But standing at the altar with Clara's hand in his, watching her smile at him with love and joy and promise, Ford felt happiness flood through him so intense it was almost painful. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Ford kissed his bride while the congregation cheered. They had a celebration at the ranch afterward, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Ford waltzed Clara around the yard, not caring that he was clumsy at dancing, just wanting to hold her close and feel the solid reality of her in his arms. Happy? Clara asked, her head resting against his chest. More than I thought possible, Ford admitted. 3 months ago I was hollow, empty, ready to drink myself to death. And now I have you and the ranch and a future I actually want to live for. It's almost too much. It's not too much, Clara said firmly. It's what you deserve, what we both deserve. We've both lost people we loved, Ford. We've both known grief. But that doesn't mean we don't deserve happiness too. Ford held her tighter, swaying to the music. I wish Thomas could have met you. He would have loved you. Tell me about him, Clara said softly. Tell me a happy memory. So Ford did. He told her about the time Thomas had tried to break a particularly stubborn horse and ended up in the water trough. About the time they'd stayed up all night helping a cow through a difficult birth, and been so proud when the calf survived. About Thomas's terrible singing voice and his love of terrible jokes, and the way he'd always seen the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. And for the first time since his brother's death, talking about Thomas didn't hurt. It felt good, felt right, like he was keeping his brother's memory alive by sharing these stories with the woman he loved. Clara listened with that focused attention she gave to everything, asking questions and laughing in the right places, and Ford fell in love with her all over again. Their first year of marriage was everything Ford could have hoped for and more. They worked side by side running the ranch, making decisions together and building on the foundation Thomas and Ford had laid. Clara's business acumen combined with Ford's practical ranching knowledge proved to be a formidable combination. They opened up the western pasture like Thomas had dreamed, and the herd grew steadily. They weathered a drought in late summer by careful water management and made it through with minimal losses. At night, they'd sit on the porch of the main house and watch the stars, talking about their plans and dreams. Clara wanted to start a garden, grow vegetables, and maybe even some flowers to make the ranch more of a home. Ford wanted to build a proper bunkhouse for the hands, something with real beds and a stove that worked. They talked about children too, tentatively at first and then with growing excitement. The idea of filling the ranch house with life and noise and love. How many do you want? Clara asked one night, her head resting on Ford's shoulder. At least 3, Ford said. Maybe 4. I was an only child before Thomas came along and I hated it. Kids should have siblings, people to grow up with. 3 or 4 sounds perfect, Clara agreed, though you're the one saying that. You won't be the one carrying them. Ford laughed and kissed the top of her head. Fair point. We'll have however many you want and I'll be grateful for everyone. Even if they're all girls, especially if they're all girls. Can you imagine? Little versions of you running around being brave and stubborn and smart. I'd be the luckiest man alive. Clara tilted her head up to kiss him properly. Or they could be little versions of you, strong and kind and loyal. Either way, they'd be pretty amazing. Their first child came 14 months after their wedding, a girl they named Sarah after Clara's mother. She had Ford's blue eyes and Clara's auburn hair, and when the doctor placed her in Ford's arms for the first time, he wept. This tiny, perfect person was his daughter, his and Clara's, a product of their love and a promise for the future. "She's beautiful," he whispered, unable to take his eyes off Sarah's scrunched-up face. "She is," Clara agreed from the bed, tired but radiant. "We made her, Ford. We made this perfect little person." Ford carried his daughter to the window and showed her the ranch spread out in the morning sun. "This is your home, Sarah. Your mother and I built this for you, for your brothers and sisters who'll come later. We built it with love and hard work and hope. And someday, if you want it, it'll be yours." Sarah just yawned, unimpressed with her father's speech, and Clara laughed from the bed. Ford joined her laughter, sitting beside his wife and daughter, his family, and feeling a contentment so complete it brought tears to his eyes again. Their second child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived 18 months later. He had Clara's green eyes and a serious expression that reminded Ford painfully of his brother. Holding this small Thomas, this new life bearing his brother's name, Ford felt like he'd come full circle. The grief wasn't gone, would never be fully gone, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet remembrance instead of a raw wound. "Thank you," he told Clara that night, after young Thomas had finally stopped crying and gone to sleep, "for letting me name him after my brother. I know it's a lot to put on a child." "It's an honor," Clara said firmly. "Your brother was a good man who died too young. Our son can carry his name and his legacy. And maybe, by living a long and happy life, he can redeem some of what was taken." Ford kissed her, deep and grateful and full of love. "How did I get so lucky? How did I stumble into a saloon one day and find you?" "We found each other," Clara corrected. "And we saved each other. That's what love does, Ford. It saves us from ourselves and gives us something to fight for." The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. Sam officially retired after Thomas was born, selling his remaining stake to Ford and Clara and moving to Tucson to be near his daughter. Before he left, he pulled Ford aside. "You've done it, boy," Sam said, his old eyes bright with satisfaction. "You've taken this ranch and made it something special. Your brother would be proud." "I couldn't have done it without Clara," Ford said honestly. "She's the one who saw what this place could be, who pushed me to stop hiding and start building again." "She's a good woman," Sam agreed. "You hold on to her, treat her right, and you keep building this legacy. Someday your children will run this place and their children after them. That's what makes a life meaningful, Ford. Not the money or the success, but the love you put into something and pass on to the next generation." Ford shook Sam's hand, then pulled the old man into a hug. "Thank you for everything, for giving Thomas and me a chance all those years ago, for not giving up on me when I fell apart, for seeing potential in a couple of young idiots who thought they could ranch." Sam laughed and clapped him on the back. "You were never idiots. Inexperienced, yes, but never idiots. You had heart, both of you. That's what matters in this life. Heart." After Sam left, the ranch truly became Ford and Clara's, no one else's vision or dream but theirs. They made changes, some small and some large. Added a library to the main house because Clara loved to read and wanted their children to love it too. Built a school for the ranch children and hired a teacher from back east. Started a breeding program for horses that became known throughout the territory for quality. But more than the physical changes, they created a culture on the Double R. One of fairness and hard work, but also of loyalty and family. The ranch hands knew their employers cared about them, would fight for them, would treat them with dignity. In return, they gave their best effort, their loyalty, their willingness to go the extra mile when needed. Their third child, another girl they named Emma, arrived 3 years after Thomas. She was a wild thing from the start, more interested in horses and cattle than dolls, and Ford adored her. She'd ride with him to check the herds, asking endless questions about everything, and Ford would answer patiently, remembering how Thomas had done the same for him all those years ago. "Papa, why do cows eat grass?" Emma asked one day when she was 4, perched in front of Ford on his saddle. "Because that's what they're built for, sweetheart. Their stomachs can digest grass and turn it into energy, which helps them grow big and strong." "Could I eat grass and get big and strong?" Ford laughed. "No, your stomach is different. You need other foods." "But that's what makes the world interesting, Emma. Everything has its place, its purpose. Cows eat grass, we take care of cows, and everyone benefits." "What's my purpose, Papa?" The question stopped Ford cold. He looked down at his daughter's serious face, so like his own, and thought about what to say. "Your purpose is to be exactly who you are, Emma. To learn and grow and find what makes you happy. To love and be loved. To build something meaningful with your life. That's all any of us can do." Emma thought about this, then nodded seriously. "Okay, Papa, I think my purpose is to be a rancher like you and Mama." "If that's what you want, then we'll teach you everything we know," Ford promised. "And someday, if you still want it, this ranch will be yours and your brothers and sisters." Life settled into a rhythm, seasons passing in the eternal cycle of ranch work. Spring for calving and branding, summer for moving herds to high pasture, fall for roundup and shipping cattle to market, winter for maintenance and planning. Ford and Clara worked together through it all, their partnership deepening with each passing year. They made time for each other too, never letting the endless demands of ranch work consume their marriage. Date nights where they'd ride out to some beautiful spot and watch the sunset. Quiet evenings on the porch after the children were asleep, just talking and being together. Stolen moments of passion that reminded them both that they were more than just business partners or parents. They were husband and wife, lovers who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day. "Do you ever regret it?" Ford asked one night, 10 years into their marriage. They were lying in bed, the window open to let in the cool desert air, and Clara's head was resting on his chest. "Giving up on California, on your aunt's ranch. Sometimes I worry I trapped you here." Clara propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her green eyes amused. "Trapped me? Ford, I chose this. I chose you. Every single day for 10 years I've chosen you and this life and this ranch. No regrets, not one. But what about your dreams? You wanted to run a ranch in California. And instead I run one in Arizona with a man I love and children I adore. How is that not exactly what I wanted?" Clara kissed him softly. "You need to stop second-guessing this, Ford. Stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're happy. We built something beautiful together. That's enough." "It's more than enough." Ford pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "I love you, Clara, more than I thought possible to love anyone. You saved my life, you know that. When you fell through that saloon door, when you looked at me and saw someone worth saving, you gave me a reason to live again." "We saved each other," Clara corrected, as she always did. "You were the one who came down those stairs after 8 days of hiding. You were the one who chose to fight instead of running. I just reminded you who you were underneath, all that grief and pain." They made love that night with a tenderness born of a decade together, of knowing each other's bodies and hearts so completely that words weren't always necessary. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Ford felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was what Thomas would have wanted for him, he realized. Not endless grief and guilt, but life. Love. Purpose. Building something that would last beyond his own brief time on Earth. The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the prosperity of the ranch. Sarah grew into a thoughtful young woman with her mother's business acumen and her father's love of the land. Thomas became a skilled horseman and cattleman, quiet and serious but with a dry wit that emerged when he felt comfortable. Emma remained wild and free, equally at home mending fences or negotiating cattle prices, refusing to be constrained by anyone's expectations of what a young woman should be. Ford and Clara added 2 more children to their family, twin boys they named James and William, and the ranch house rang with laughter and chaos and love. Ford sometimes thought about the hollow-eyed man he'd been all those years ago, sitting in that saloon room for 8 days straight, and he could barely recognize himself. That man had been broken, lost, drowning in grief with no way out, but Clara had given him a way out. Had seen past the brokenness to the man he could still become, and together they'd built something that mattered, something that would outlast them both. A ranch that employed dozens of families and treated them well. Children who would carry on their legacy of hard work and fairness. A love story that had started with blood and fear, but had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ford took Clara back to Holbrook, to the saloon where they'd first met. It was under new management now, Pete having retired years ago, but the building was the same. Ford led Clara upstairs to the room where he'd spent those 8 hollow-eyed days, where he'd been ready to drink himself to death. "This is where it started," he said, standing in the small room that looked even smaller now than he remembered. "This is where I was when you fell through that door downstairs, where I'd been for 8 days, hiding from life." Clara looked around the shabby room at the bed and the window and the floorboards stained with spilled whiskey. "It's hard to imagine you here. The Ford I know would never give up like that." "The Ford you know is the Ford you helped create," Ford said. "You showed me there were still things worth fighting for, worth living for. You gave me hope when I had none." He took her hands, looking into those green eyes that had seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. "Thank you, Clara, for not walking away, for seeing something in me worth saving, for building this life with me." Clara's eyes were bright with tears. "Thank you for letting me, for opening your heart even when it was broken, for being brave enough to love again after loss, for giving me a home and a family and a purpose." They kissed in that shabby room, the same room where Ford had hit bottom all those years ago. But he wasn't that hollow-eyed man anymore. He was a husband and father, a rancher and businessman, a man who'd found redemption through love and hard work and the grace of second chances. As they left Holbrook that day, riding back toward the double R and the life they'd built together, Ford felt nothing but gratitude. For Clara, for their children, for the ranch and the land and the opportunity to build something meaningful. For the brother who'd taught him about vision and possibility. For Sam, who'd given them their chance. For every person who'd played a part in bringing him from that dark room to this moment of joy and contentment. The desert stretched around them, harsh and beautiful under the Arizona sun, the same desert that had witnessed his lowest moment and his greatest happiness. Ford reached over and took Clara's hand as they rode, and she smiled at him with that smile that still made his heart skip after 20 years. "I love you," he said, because those words never got old, never stopped being important. "I love you too," Clara replied. "Always have, always will." Their children were waiting at the ranch when they returned. All 5 of them gathered on the porch with their grandmother, Sam's wife, who'd moved back to help with the twins and never left. Sarah was helping Emma with her arithmetic. Thomas was teaching James and William to rope a fence post, and they all looked up when their parents rode in. "Mama, Papa," the twins yelled, running to meet them. Ford dismounted and scooped up both boys, laughing at their chatter about what they'd done while he and Clara were gone. Clara hugged Sarah and Emma, checked Thomas's latest bruise from a disagreement with a young bull, and herded everyone inside for supper. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ford and Clara sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge. This was their favorite time, these quiet moments when they could just be together without the demands of children or ranch or business. 20 years, Clara said softly. Can you believe it's been 20 years since Holbrook? Feels like yesterday sometimes, Ford admitted. I can still see you falling through that saloon door, still remember thinking that you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen despite the blood and the fear. I was a mess, Clara laughed, bleeding and terrified and running for my life, not exactly how I imagined meeting my future husband. And I was a hollow-eyed drunk who hadn't left his room in 8 days, Ford countered. Not exactly hero material, but somehow it worked out. It worked out because we chose to make it work, Clara said, because we saw something in each other worth fighting for. Because we were willing to be brave even when we were scared. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder in that familiar gesture of affection. And because we kept choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. Ford wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Here's to 20 more years of choosing each other, of building this life and raising these children and growing old together on this ranch. I'll drink to that, Clara said, and they touched their glasses of lemonade together in a toast. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of life. Sarah married a young lawyer from Flagstaff and brought him to live on the ranch, where he proved surprisingly adept at handling the legal side of their growing business. Thomas took over much of the day-to-day running of the cattle operation, showing the same steady competence his uncle and namesake had been known for. Emma scandalized half of Arizona by becoming one of the first female cattle buyers in the territory, traveling to distant ranches to negotiate deals and earning a reputation for fairness and shrewd judgment. The twins, James and William, were inseparable and developed a talent for breeding horses that took the ranch in exciting new directions. They started a program of crossing working ranch horses with thoroughbreds to create animals that combined speed with stamina, and their horses became highly sought after throughout the Southwest. Ford and Clara watched it all with pride and satisfaction, seeing their children take the foundation they'd built and expand on it in ways they'd never imagined. The ranch that had been Thomas and Ford's dream, that had become Ford and Clara's reality, was now becoming the next generation's legacy. We did good, Ford said one evening when he and Clara were in their 60s, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Sarah's children, Thomas's children, Emma's adopted daughter, all running and laughing in the golden evening light. We did, Clara agreed. Her hair was more silver than auburn now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the desert sun, but Ford thought she'd never been more beautiful. We built something that will last, Ford, something that will outlive us both and keep going for generations. Ford took her hand, his own hands gnarled now from decades of hard work, but still strong. I was thinking about that room in Holbrook today, about the man I was, sitting there for 8 days with nothing but whiskey and grief. And I thought about how close I came to just giving up completely, to letting the Clayton gang and Thomas's death destroy me. But you didn't give up, Clara said softly. You came down those stairs when I needed help. You chose to fight instead of running. That took courage, Ford. More courage than most people ever have to find. I wouldn't have found it without you, Ford said. You were the reason, Clara. The reason I came down, the reason I fought, the reason I lived. Everything good in my life for the past 40 years has come from the moment you fell through that saloon door." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Don't make me cry, old man. You know I hate crying." "Then I'll just say thank you," Ford said, pulling her close. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for 40 years of partnership and friendship and love." "Right back at you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me too, you know, gave me a home and a family and a purpose when I had nothing. Loved me when I was broken and scared, built a life with me that exceeded my wildest dreams." She wiped her eyes and laughed. "Look at us, getting all sentimental in our old age." "We've earned the right to be sentimental," Ford said. "We've lived a good life, Clara, a meaningful life. Whatever happens from here, I have no regrets." They sat on the porch as the sun set, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play, and Ford felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. He'd come so far from that hollow-eyed man in the Holbrook saloon, from 8 days of despair and grief and surrender. Clara had pulled him back from the edge, had given him something to fight for, had shown him that life after loss was possible. And together, they'd built something beautiful. A ranch that provided for dozens of families. Children who'd grown into capable, compassionate adults. Grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward. A love story that had started in blood and fear, but had transformed into something enduring and true. Ford lived to see his great-grandchildren, lived to see the Double R expand to over 10,000 acres and become one of the most respected ranches in Arizona. He lived to see the Wild West slowly transform into something more settled and civilized, saw the railroad bring prosperity and progress, saw the territory become a state. But through all the changes, the Double R remained constant, a place of hard work and fair dealing, of loyalty and family. Sarah's son took over the business operations when she retired, and he proved as shrewd as his grandmother. Thomas's children became expert cattlemen, continuing the tradition of quality and careful management. Emma's daughter became a veterinarian, one of the first women to do so in the state, and brought modern animal husbandry practices to the ranch. The twins' children continued the horse breeding program, earning national recognition for their bloodlines. On Ford's 80th birthday, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Over 50 people crowded into the main house and spilled out onto the porch and lawn. 3 generations of Northwoods and their extended families. There was food and music and laughter, and Ford sat in a place of honor with Clara beside him, watching it all with wonder. "How did we get so lucky?" he asked Clara, who at 78 was still sharp as a tack and twice as stubborn. "How did 2 broken people stumbling together in a Holbrook saloon end up here?" "We made our own luck," Clara said firmly. "We chose each other, chose to fight, chose to build instead of destroy. And we never stopped choosing, Ford. That's the secret. Not some grand gesture or perfect romance, just choosing each other every single day for 57 years. Ford kissed her, not caring that their grandchildren were watching and giggling. After 57 years of marriage, he'd learned that the important things should never be hidden or postponed. Love should be expressed, gratitude should be spoken, moments should be savored. "I would choose you again," he said, looking into her green eyes that age had dimmed but not dulled. "In every lifetime, in every circumstance, I would choose you." "Good thing," Clara said with that smile he'd fallen in love with all those years ago, "because you're stuck with me, Ford Northwood, now and always." The party continued around them, their families celebrating the life they'd built together. Ford looked at it all and felt nothing but gratitude. For Clara, for their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for the ranch and the land and the opportunities they'd been given, for the brother who'd taught him to dream, for Sam who'd given them their chance, for every person who'd helped along the way, but most of all, for that moment in a Holbrook saloon when he'd been at his lowest, when he'd been hollow-eyed and broken after 8 days of hiding from life. For Clara falling through that door, bleeding and afraid but alive. For finding the courage to come down those stairs, to help instead of hiding, to choose life instead of surrender. That moment had changed everything, had set him on a path that led to this moment surrounded by love and family and legacy. That moment when the cowboy who'd been hollow-eyed and broken chose to be there, really there, for someone who needed him. And in being there for Clara, Ford had saved himself. Ford and Clara lived out their remaining years in contentment on the ranch they'd built together. They passed peacefully within months of each other, Clara first and then Ford, as if he couldn't bear to be without her for long. They were buried on a hill overlooking the Double R, beneath a sky so vast and blue, it seemed to go on forever. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued the legacy they'd started, keeping the ranch prosperous and fair, treating their workers with dignity and the land with respect. The Double R became a landmark in Arizona ranching, known for quality cattle and horses and for the family values that had guided it for generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind blew just right, ranch hands swore they could see 2 figures on the ridge, standing close together and looking out over the land they'd loved. A tall man with blue eyes and a woman with auburn hair going silver, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The hollow-eyed cowboy who'd spent 8 days in a Holbrook saloon had found redemption through love. And the frightened woman who'd fallen through that door had found a home and a partner and a purpose. Together, they'd built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and hard work and second chances. Their story became part of the Double Artique's history, told to each new generation. How Ford and Clara had met in Holbrook during a time of danger and fear. How they'd fought the Dawson brothers and won. How they'd returned to the ranch and built a life together despite all the odds against them. How love and courage and choosing each other every day had transformed 2 broken people into something whole and beautiful and lasting. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way. With Ford and Clara on their porch in their old age, holding hands and watching the stars emerge over the desert they'd loved. 2 people who'd saved each other and built a legacy that would endure for generations. 2 people who proved that even in the wild, harsh landscape of the Arizona desert, love could take root and flourish and create something extraordinary. The Double R still stands today, run by the 6th generation of Northwoods, still guided by the principles Ford and Clara established all those years ago. The main house has been expanded and modernized, but the original adobe structure remains at its core. And on the mantel in the living room sits a photograph of Ford and Clara on their wedding day, young and hopeful and so clearly in love. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "Ford and Clara Northwood, founders of the Double R." They built this ranch with love, sustained it with hard work, and left us a legacy of integrity and family. May we always honor their memory by living up to their example. And on that hill, overlooking the ranch, beneath the vast Arizona sky, 2 headstones stand side by side. Ford Northwood and Clara Northwood, beloved parents and grandparents, partners in life and love, together always. The hollow-eyed cowboy had found his redemption. The frightened woman had found her home. And together, they'd created something that would last forever, A love story written across the wild Arizona desert, as enduring as the land itself.